Hi, everyone. Welcome to this conversation. Hi. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's so good to see you. Um, and yes, our guest is here, right on time.
Hello.
Hi, Ethel. Karibu sana.
Asante sana.
Welcome,
How
welcome,
are
welcome.
you?
I'm good. I'm hot. I'm dying. Nervy is trying to kill me with this heat, but I'm surviving.
You know what? I missed it and I would take it over this so we can swap if you want.
I would
I'm more
love
than
that. I
happy
would
to.
actually love that. Please, just for like a
Ah,
day. A
the
day.
grass
A
is
day would be
always
nice.
greener. It's always
Yes.
greener.
All right. Welcome, everyone. I think we'll give like a few more minutes for those who are joining to join. But yeah, it's good to see all of you here. And yeah, welcome to our first Culture Catch Up Public History Talk of 2025. It's such an honor to have you share space and time with us. And like I said, as we wait for a minute or so for others to join, we would love to know where you are joining us from, and you can drop that in the comment section down below. And yeah, our guest Ethel Tawe, amongst many other illustrious things, which I will get into later on, is a globetrotter. She's my personal favorite globetrotter. So Ethel, please, where in the world are you joining us from?
Uh, I am in London at the moment.
Right.
Yes, I'm joining from London, very much missing home in Tanzania, nearer to you.
Yeah.
But it's been nice to be here. Change of scene. It's not the best of times necessarily because of everything, but
Mm.
yeah, I'm still very grateful to be here, to be joining you all in this community. Yeah, to be speaking to you especially, actually.
Yeah, no, it's like, guys, these are the conversations Ethel and I normally have when we're just kicking with one another. So
Mm,
it's really lovely to like open up
grateful.
others to join in.
Yeah,
Ah,
full
yeah.
circle.
Oh, full circle moment. Actually, I was going to get into that. I was actually going to get into how this is such a full circle moment.
Yes.
But yeah, I think we can start. Such lovely people I'm seeing in
Andrew?
the joining us. Yeah, it's so heartwarming. So
Yeah.
yeah, before I begin, I'd like to share two main housekeeping notes in order to make this a comfortable space for all who are here. Um, Firstly, we do welcome any comments and questions from you. So feel free to utilize the comment section to your heart's content. And secondly, we would ask that you keep your words and interactions in the comment section in the comment section respectful. And our conversation today will probably be about 45 minutes long, and we would love to include your questions. And so again, utilize the comment section to your heart's content. So yeah, we can kick things off. I'll introduce the theme and then of course introduce Ethel. And so our theme for the conversation today is listening to the liminal, anti-disciplinary approaches to archival practice. And for us here at ADH, our community building practice is centered on thinking outside the norm of what we have been taught to think archiving is. And for us, we see play, imagination, deep listening, and critical thinking to be a part of subverting this norm. And I think for us, that's why we were so deeply pulled to your work, Ethel, and your archival practice, listening to images, and also to your title of being an anti-disciplinary artist. I think for me, when I first encountered listening to images and also it's tied to like Tina Kampт, you opened up my world in such a brilliant way. And then again, when you shared that you are taking on the title of being an anti-disciplinary artist, I think for me that was also like, wow, a lot to like rethink and reflect on within myself and within my personal practice. And so I think it gives me great pleasure to now introduce Ethel. So Ethel-Ruth Tawe is an anti-disciplinary artist and creative researcher exploring memory in Africa and its diaspora. Image making, storytelling, and time traveling compose the framework of her inquiry. From photography, collage, and text to moving image, installation, and other time based media, Ethel examines culture and technology, often from a speculative lens. Her burgeoning curatorial practice took form in the inaugural exhibition titled African Ancient Futures and continues to expand in a myriad of audiovisual experiments. So, karibu sana, Ethel. And also, I forgot to mention, my name is Wari Monduba. And again, it's so great to have you here, but welcome, Ethel.
Yes, same thing.
Yeah, and
That's
right off the
amazing.
bat, going back to this being a full circle moment, it's really special because I think we first connected on Instagram. I think we
Yes,
did. I
we
think that's
did.
where we first met. Yes,
Yes,
on this
yes,
space.
yes.
What year was
On this
that?
very
Yes.
complicated space.
Yes.
It must have been, I feel like around COVID time, so 2020, 2021, like
Yes.
around, was it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so. Yes. Yeah. Going back to globetrotting, I think I was seeing you live your best life in Ghana, and I was like, yes, this.
In Ghana, yes. Actually, that
Yes.
would add up then. Yeah,
Yes.
around that
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
And
yeah, like I said, your work continues to leave such a deep impression on me, and I know for sure that I'm not the only one. And so, yeah, before we begin, I would like to invite into this space a wonderful introduction question that I came across in an interview between Wangeshi Mutu and Solange, who are both water signs and who are so aptly talking about transiting beyond disciplines. And we are both water signs. And
yeah,
here's the conversation we're
so
having
cute.
about, transiting beyond disciplines. And so the beautiful question I came across in that interview is, where are you right now, both literally, as in
Mm,
where you are physically, but also
mm,
what does this space you're in represent for you?
mm. Well, like I said, physically, I'll start there. I'm in London.
Yeah.
Um, and it's bittersweet because in many ways this place feels like home. Um, but in many ways there's this constant yearning for home that has followed me my whole life probably,
Mm,
where I'm not really sure, you know, what home is in terms of like a physical thing.
mhm,
And what that has become for me is more um, a state of being rather than a place.
mm,
But this is definitely one of the physical places where I feel like very grounded, especially after months of being basically on the road, living out of a suitcase for the last 2, 3 months.
yeah,
It's very, very nice to be grounded, to be here. Yeah, and I'm just in a place of a lot of transition, you know. You mentioned being water sign. Scorpio season was recent, not too long ago,
yes,
and that was a big transition for me into 30. So I'm still processing that.
yeah,
There's lots of transitions physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. I'm in a place of just understanding what this new season is and what it'll bring. Um, yeah, and I'm also feeling really grateful. Like I said, just very, very grateful to be here, to be thinking with a community that I really value, um, to be shape shifting constantly,
yeah,
and like adding on to, all the different things,
yeah.
the different disciplines or lack thereof, which we're moving out of and into. So yeah, just feeling very, very grateful.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. And yeah, speaking about like shape shifting and experimentation, when I look at your practice, that seems to be something that's very present. So yeah, I'd be really curious to know how your practice of experimentation and shape shifting guided you towards stepping into this articulation of being an anti-disciplinary
Mm.
artist. So yeah, actually I think I'd love for you to define what being an anti-disciplinary artist means for you. I mean, definitions can also be like, I mean, sometimes can be very rigid, but like, feel free to play with that
Yeah,
definition as much as you like. But yeah, what does it mean for you to be an
yeah,
anti-disciplinary artist?
yeah. That's also something that is embraced in the term. I feel, just the fact that it's always shifting. So even for me, it's constantly. I'm always redefining that. But I'll start first with thinking about what it is being an artist. That took me a while to even declare myself as an artist
Yeah.
and that comes from my growing up and not really having that represented to me in the sense of like a practice or like something that's valid to pursue. So I only came to that part of it. I would say in the last 4 years or so of really understanding myself as an artist, and then I kept being in this perpetual state of and this and this and also this and also this, and I was like, okay, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, all these different things, and which was great in many ways to know that I can be these things, but then I also started to question exactly what you're saying. What end are these ands? So for me, it's like these disciplines in some ways, or the term discipline is important in terms of like a ritual or something you return to or a practice, but at the same time, is it limiting how I understand myself? And for me, I came across a definition actually around anti-disciplinary from House of Dread, where they mentioned mentioned it as manifesting something new. And that really resonated because instead of it being this thing where you're trying to cage in, it's actually opening up into something that's about world building. And I right away connected with that. So those were one of the first definitions that made a lot of sense. And then, of course, it's anti, so there is an active refusal there. And I was thinking about the Practicing Refusal Collective and some of the ideas they have around what refusal really is. And my background is in international development, and there's been this conversation in that space around like experts during my studies, at least back then. It was this dilemma of like, how do we approach things and who are the experts who can determine how our societies are shaped? And I always really didn't resonate with this idea, and I felt there's this tyranny of experts that continues to follow us who feel like they have all the answers, and how can I refuse that in my practice, and how is that also existing in this culture and art space, and how do we liberate ourselves from these rigid frameworks that we sometimes don't fit in and we've just adopted oftentimes from the West, and more into manifesting something new. So there's a sort of duality there where it's opening up space, but it's also closing up certain others. So that's what it's become for me. There's a lot of other citations within that I've continued to move into, especially Edward Glissant's idea of opacity, and how not everything must be transparent. Like there are things that are sacred, there are things that language holds in a very specific way that, for example, the hegemonic language, English, in a lot of these spaces might not accommodate. So I think I really, started to understand anti-disciplinary practice as that, as well as a sort of opacity. It's been that as it moves forward and as it shape shifts, it's just been taking on its own many definitions.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And as you've stepped into this definition and as you've because it's like been a tracing, it's like been many like points and glimmers that have led you into this space. I'd really be curious to know how it feels to take on that aspect of your being where you are right now. Yeah, just like how does it like feel and resonate within your body, and like what has that birthed for you so far?
I think it's really in the way I work, even just like on a daily basis, where it's more open-ended. Like I work in iterations, really. I think I'm, again, embracing shape-shifting process-based approaches, because as someone who, for example, I have a lot of anxiety around things, and I think it comes also from this idea that things have to be a very certain way. And so it's helped me like free myself from that essentially, and just actually know that it does not have to fit into anything. It can shift. It doesn't have to appear the same way anytime. You don't owe anyone anything. And it's a reflection of life itself, really. And it is exactly what an archival practice is. If you really think about, you know, how we understand time as nonlinear, everything is adding on to itself. And I should say, actually, so one of the big definitions, even for me, again, back to definitions, with thinking about Stuart Hall's idea of a living archive, that is also very much embedded in anti-disciplinary practice, but also how I've come to understand time, how I've come to understand archival practice. I could just read exactly what I mean here. So he says something about the very idea of a living archive contradicts this fantasy of completeness. It cannot be complete because our present practice immediately adds to it, and our new interpretations inflect it differently. And I feel like that's exactly how I've been moving through with it. Just knowing that with every breath, with every moment, as is life, so is this practice. And on a practical level, that looks like, for example, if I have an installation of sorts, especially because I'm working with a lot of time-based media, I'm working with moving image, sometimes still, I'm working with installation, working with collage and video. The moment it is experienced is a very specific moment. And if you're thinking about how it resonates and registers in the body at those times, it can never really be replicated the same way. So I'm really interested in, really embracing that on a practical level, even in the ways that these installations appear in space, and adapting to wherever they appear, and also that moment in time, wherever possible. It's not always possible or practical, but, you know, if I'm showing, and I know you know this because we've talked about, you know, the installation in Cayman, for example, where there's all these factors that, in that case, shape the project very differently. I was working on image frequency modulation while I was there in residency, and came across so many hurdles because it's this island where I can't access a lot of things, looking for like old radios to install. But instead of kind of the convenience maybe of going out and, you know, sourcing things, the inconvenience actually birthed something really interesting. And I think previously I would maybe struggle to embrace that a lot more, but, you know, actually allowing myself to be like, well, I can't find this thing, so I'm gonna go speak to people or look on the streets and like actually source it that way and bring it into the work. And then in that case, they return to their homes. The objects I gathered and borrowed, they return to their homes after that installation was done. Which really for me was important to see how to work that way. Of course, it's also complicated in some certain senses because you're inviting so many other people into the work, but it really just makes it much more reflective of the time and the place for me. So yeah, it's looked like that on some practical levels. Yeah, that's really what it's been.
Yeah, thanks for sharing with me, because I think I'm a very much like I'm a type A person, and if like something does not go according to plan, then it can be quite stress inducing. But I think here you invite a really beautiful thing of like leaning into what the inconvenience is teaching you, and paying attention, or rather giving attention to what can be birthed from that. And I think for me, it's kind of like now inviting that aspect of the liminal, this like push between like, you know, what you expect something to be and then what actually happens, and like this third space in between, navigating those two. And so yeah, like now going back and touching on like the liminal, I think for me, the liminal also presents this really beautiful space. in terms of disrupting like linearity and dominant constructs of what we've been taught time and space should look like. And you've mentioned this, and I think for me, listening to images is such a beautiful embodiment of embracing the liminal. And before we like dive into listening to images as an archival practice, I would love for you to expand on why the name listening to images, because I think a lot of us, when we think about like imagery, moving and still, we think about looking, not necessarily listening. And so,
Mm,
yeah, could you
mm.
expand on why listening to images? And yeah, how you came into that name.
Yeah, so the name is borrowed from the wonderful work of Black feminist theorist Tina Campt, whose work I return to very often, um, whose work has really guided me and also introduced me to other work in conversation, and has taught me about citational practice as well, which is also a big part, you know, of honoring the lineage that all of this is existing within. We're not operating in these silos. Everything is overlapping in many ways. And yeah, for me, it was really about honoring that and what it's given me, um, as both a theory and a method. So the book, Listening to Images, is really about counterintuitive ways of engaging with photographic archives. And she goes a lot into visual, sonic, and haptic frequencies and defining those in very counterintuitive ways, in ways that I myself didn't really initially. Yeah, it's really, I had to actively attune myself to that, to be able to not just look or see, but actually feel above anything. And I think that has led me to approach even curating, or assemblage or gathering of any sorts, which is in the case of this platform, from that entry point, kind of scanning what registers, and also seeing how things are in this continuum, and this constellation of occurrences and encounters across time, across space, that when they come into proximity, something new happens. So again, it's this trying to experiment and trying to, yeah, to find something new. And really everything is experimentation. Like, to go back again to your point of like, nothing is permanent either. So I think for me, it's been embracing that impermanence and thinking specifically about what that means in digital space, and including embracing the tools that it offers, but also critiquing this algorithmic violence that it comes with, and trying to see how to navigate that and to offer, yeah, just other perspectives or invite rather, others to think together. That's an aspect of this platform also I'm trying to expand on in time as it flows. How to really, have this as like a collective. I want to say archive, but that word also bothers me sometimes these days. But yes, archive. Yes.
Can we go into that? Can we? Because I mean, this was also a conversation about like archival practice and like subverting the ways in which we've been taught how to go about building an archival. So yes, please, could you like touch on your questions about like the word archive?
Yeah. It's like certain limitations with English, right? It's just like archive or like museum. It's just, for me at least, it's even the root of it. It's prioritizing written records, archive. Whereas a lot of what I'm interested in is about oral tradition. It's about embodied
knowledge and
gestures,
wisdom.
and it's,
Yeah.
you know, it's completely not prioritizing written records. And there's many other languages that offer really interesting translations or words for archive that are way more open. But I think, yeah, just thinking even about language. I know Banji was on here at some point, who does really interesting work with on language. And yeah, it's thinking about how our mother tongues can even expand our conceptions of some of these things, but then also what it means to use these English words but actually means something else has been my dilemma with the word and other words as well in English. But just so we can understand each other, which of course we need to, but yeah, it's giving graveyard, which is absolutely not what this is about. Which I guess the living resurrects that, right? Living archive, then it feels more okay that we're talking about something else.
Yeah.
But archive on its own, yeah, it's it's giving that for me right now.
Thanks for that. But this is like a really brilliant question, and I think that has come in that we can like weave into this conversation, and it is how have you as an archive worker navigated things like disparities of access to resources and community? And also just the inconvenience of archival erasure and silences. So I guess what you're saying, talking about like the violence that comes with, encountering the archives app as it has been handed to us, the written. Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think access is such a huge obstacle and like rupture really in our timeline of progress of any kind, especially as
Yeah.
African people. I think I'm always like asking like just the idea that I know with African digital heritage, there's a lot around restitution and thinking about how we don't have access to our own history, our own material culture, and how that can completely disrupt how we move. And again, to ADH, thinking about how the digital can be a place that bridges that for now, or I guess moving forward, because we're not probably going back from this. But then also thinking about the violence that happens in this digital space. So there's a work I showed. Oh, actually, it's still on right now. It's in Cameroon. And for me, that was interesting to think about access because, and I know you know this work very well because we thought and worked through it together before. And it was one that really was one that I battled with this idea of access and digital archives. And for me, on a personal level, revisiting my home digitally because I have been away for so long, and the only way in reverse I could visit that was digitally, right? Through like satellite imagery, kind of quite literally mapping out like where was my home, where is this? So I'm like grateful on one hand, but then while searching through like literally on Google Maps or wherever, whatever digital archive we're using, you then notice there's all these omissions, like there's chunks of the map that are just quite literally missing.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, like my people are just non-existent according to the internet. What does that really mean? And then in terms of like mapping, I should say. But then on the other hand, this work I mentioned that's showing in Cameroon was also thinking about restitutions of these entities, these objects to Cameroon, which has been an ongoing process. So on one hand, there's like, it feels like we're working to close this gap on physical materials returning, yet there's still this huge gap digitally of access that we're continuing, which is very typical of colonialism, to mask one problem while also creating a new one.
Yes.
So I think it's, again, like, I don't know if I'm answering exactly your question. Sorry, but I'm just kind of thinking through, yeah, there's a lot of contradiction with access in my experience, even on the times that I felt like I have had access to the material, I've thought through these erasures and filled them with artistic interventions.
Yeah.
I still at the same time wonder what that means long term. So yeah, just sitting with the contradictions of it all, and also again thinking of how we manifest new forms, new things, and for thinking about speculation even as a valid way of coming together and offering new ways of understanding what was lost.
Thanks for that. And now going back to manifesting new things, and going back to now listening to images, I'd be really curious to know what gathering these images, what new things have manifested for you from gathering these images and interacting with the work of the different artists that you've come across. Yeah.
I think it's really affirmed this idea of a continuum. I don't know if Justin from Afrovisionism is on here,
Hey,
but
our homie.
yes, this idea of the continuum is really what it's emerged for me from that, and affirming that we are really just living, when we find, I'm trying to think of an example of an artwork or a video, an installation work from way back that I come across, and then I see something today or, from recent times, and it's literally speaking the same language. And perhaps these artists never knew about each other. Perhaps they did. I don't know. But I'm seeing them in conversation with each other. And I think that it's so beautiful to see how we continue to extend and add upon ourselves, our lineages. So that's something that's really emerged for me from bringing these together and thinking about, even on a personal level, my own lineage and where I would want to, carry forward. So, yeah.
Back to the circles, always back to the circles. I think I came across this quote that I always refer to, where it's by an indigenous scholar, Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's written a really beautiful book called Braiding Sweetgrass, and she talks about how history is prophecy. And I think for me, it just always goes back to that thing of, we move in like spirals and circles.
Exactly.
It's never
Yeah.
for one linear thing. It's
Yeah.
always
And
one.
artists,
Yeah.
and artists are a huge part of, speculating the future, of course,
Yes.
and, contributing that way at least to thinking of what is possible, because in order to reach where we want to go, we have to be able to imagine it. So imagination and nurturing that is where we come in.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's also, again, a sort of divination, a sort of speculation. And what was the word you used again? You said it is
History as prophecy.
prophecy is the
Yeah.
word. Yeah.
Yeah, history as prophecy.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really
Yeah, I
beautiful.
love that.
Yeah. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to share them in the comments. We welcome those. But yeah, I also have a question for you regarding what it means to also navigate copyright and intellectual property. When gathering like the images, on listening to images, because that's something that I've also really encountered within my own like archival practices. This sticky thing of copyright and intellectual property. So yeah, how have you
Yeah.
gone about navigating that when gathering?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll speak about my practice more broadly with gathering material. So a lot of what I look at is my own family archives. Ever since I started working more and more with archival material, I inherited those. They're not mine at the end of the day. So I'm also very intentionally aware of what it means to be a custodian of these photographs I've inherited. And then it makes me also think about the rigidness of copyright, however important it is also based on a capitalist idea of ownership and, the way things have to operate with very specific linearity, which again, not to say that it's not important, but I don't think we understood or we have, sort of developed our own understanding of this in the same way in non-Western contexts. So that's where my ideas around copyright started to kind of already, not be so clear.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I've also worked a lot with colonial material, which is problematic in all ways. But also, what does it mean to work with that, and what does it mean to continue to show that, whether it is in the public domain or not? I think about copyright there more as like, is it a provocation? Is it intentional for me to maybe even use it regardless? I'm trying to, say something.
Yes.
It is also slippery slopes, but it's also something that if you're actively thinking about speaking to whoever you need to speak to about, I think there's always ways around that, especially with troubling archives or collections like that. Then, of course, the stuff in the public domain, which are always safe to use, but there's obviously limitations there because, it's not always either if you're looking at images of the, resolution you might need, or, whatever else it is. It might just be a certain fragments of it that you have access to publicly. And then otherwise, there's long processes of licensing that have had to be done with a lot of this work, unfortunately, which again is very, very, it's very strange, for example, to be licensing an image of something very problematic and actively paying to an estate this material. So again, those contradictions very much are embedded in the work, but again, the active choice to disrupt that and has also been a very, very valid option for me, to be transparent.
I remember. Sorry to interrupt, but I think when I was scrolling through when you made the post about being an anti-disciplinary artist, I remember you referencing the Practicing Refusal Collective, which they state a refusal to embrace the terms of diminished subjecthood. So I think that is
exactly. And that also transfers into the work itself, sometimes visually for me, again, a choice of what to show, what not to show, but also how to show it is a big part. An example is a work I showed at Photo Ireland, where it was from a collection of a photo book from Angola, I believe, and it was these really demeaning sort of headshots, front view, profile, back, very much like a catalog, kind of how you would photograph flora and fauna, which is essentially what they were trying to place African people as, or within the same categories. And for that one, for example, I only chose to show images where their heads are turned intentionally, because then they're refusing to look or to be gazed upon yet again, as they have been continued, or they had continued been looked at for all this time. So, and then for some of the other photographs that were more portraits, and veiling those with questions before looking at them, you have to pose these questions to yourself, because what does it mean for us to continue to consume or look at these images without questioning the context in which they were made, but also what they mean today. As, for example, another project I'm working on is thinking about how all these typed photographs were actually then essentially transferred onto the internet, scanned, quite literally. There were projects of scanning these books into the internet to create the early algorithms, the early machine learning. So it was already racist at its conception. And now we're trying to kind of unlearning or training and doing all these things, because at the end of the day, technology is just a reflection of ourselves. It's not separate from us. And if we live in a prejudiced world, then these machines will also be. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for sharing that. A lot to mull over, but I think for me, yeah, especially when you did like the photo island and tapping into like the photo book algorithms and how those are a reflection of the algorithms that we encounter here. I think for me that was really mind opening, and I think touching on that, we can dive into some of the questions. And the one that I'm seeing now is a question in which they ask, I'm interested in hearing more about how you archive your body of work. What spaces does it live in now? And where do you see your work sitting in the future?
That's a really good question. It lives in my body, a lot of it. Because it takes so many shapes, I obviously have the material in which I input into, whether it's a screening or an installation. And then I have the photographs, which I keep, and they travel. To be honest, they travel a lot, which is also part of the work and thinking about how how they move and circulate. But I do also prioritize digitizing all of those. And it's interesting to digitize things over time because they change. Like if you scan a photograph that is, for example, already damaged, which I have a lot of, if you scan it, I don't know, I scanned some like 5 years ago. If I scan them now and put them side by side, they're already different. There's, of course, these archival sleeves and practical ways to try to, preserve. But I also kind of find it interesting to see it take its own shape and change, because this idea of it staying exactly the same, and it's giving graveyard again. Like we want to, our museum, we want to keep it in this exact state that is so pure. And I'm not really a big fan of that approach, even though, again, I'm not necessarily a fan of destroying things either. I'm not saying that. I think it's just, finding a fine line between how things naturally change and what we can do to, just kind of nurture it as it changes rather than cage it. So my work is existing in many forms. It's safe, if if you're curious of that. It is it's an interesting one also, because if you think of time-based media, even like performance, which has been also something I've become a bit interested in more, it's like, how do you archive that as well? You can record a moment, but it will never be the same. So I think as much as I can, I do prioritize documentation of every iteration. And I think it's also really interesting for memory work, because what happens is at the end of it, when I revisit these things and I watch or I look at the photographs, I see something new each time. Then that then helps me layer upon it the next time. So I think, again, it's working in that way, that it's not about it being that moment of how it's documented, but more about what it can teach us, because that's the point of photographs or documents or objects, entities, especially in the African context. It's not to be buried.
Thanks for that. I think, just like also, I guess it's celebrating the way life is, because we also not our bodies change, like we ourselves, life changes, things decay, things rebirth. So I think it's just like celebrating those natural movements.
Exactly.
And there's another question here on the notion of academic language when moving between the institute and the non-institutional spaces. When moving between worlds, how do you also move between languages?
That's a very good question. I've been thinking a lot about code switch. I don't know if that's directly related to what you're asking, but I think it's interesting how we kind of adapt ourselves to different environments. And it's also to do with the question earlier about access. because it's on one hand, the intention to have things, whether within an academic setting where it's still in English, but it is kind of coded in many ways, a lot of times, because it's often inaccessible language. It's like the paradox of that being something that we can learn and expand from, because, for example, listening to images, which I have here actually, is, not always something that I immediately understood. For example, the language was very counterintuitive, I would say. So I had to really think about, okay, it's actually opening up my world in so many ways, because I don't really understand everything, but it's teaching me so much. So on one hand, how do I move with that? I think I embrace it and I try to see to what extent, but then I also think about access and what it means. If, for example, you're not engaging with this work in the same way. And then also I think about, on the other hand, language itself as a technology, because a lot of my work, I'm image frequency modulation, for example, it's in my mother tongue, Limbum. So I have these moving image works that loop, and it's just a recital of proverbs in my mother tongue. And not only is it double layered, like encoded, it's Limbum, which is a tiny language relatively. Even in Cameroon, where I'm from, it's not spoken widely. But then on the other hand, it's also a proverb. So even if you do speak Limbum, it's not necessarily also accessible either. It's like, I'm not sure, what all of them, at least before I started studying them, I really didn't understand what they meant, even while understanding the language. So I think there's a beauty there, that those were lessons for me of like, I don't understand this, but I feel it. And so it's beyond literal language. And even when I show these works, I feel like sometimes some feedback around it is so interesting, because people actually somehow understand it even without understanding them, because there's a feeling that's conveyed in the visuals and in other ways, and the motion, which is different for everyone. But yeah, I think I've been enjoying thinking about that, and then thinking about code switch as well, even as like on a technological aspect, but also as an embodied technology that we perform in this world. But yeah, I'll keep it short there. I feel like time is going.
Oh, but it's moving in the most delicious way, because I'm just sitting here and I'm like, wow, 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 wow. And yeah, thank you, Travis and Tarona. I think there was some exchange around like copyright. I think there's like a lot there. Thank you for Tarona for sharing that resource that we can all like access. I think we can leave it with one last question. The question is something yes, yeah, something I always grapple with regarding photographic archives, and also in line with things changing. Do you ever consider whether consent is forever? This is in relation to the subjects and the sitters.
That's a really interesting question. I don't know why it made me think right away of these daguerreotypes from Harvard. You know the ones that Carrie Mae Weem used in this work?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, that were really problematically taken, obviously seized from the subjects, because these were enslaved people whose images were made to kind of categorize them as something very specific without their consent.
Yeah.
But what has happened decades later, their descendants, specifically Tamara Lanier, has sued Harvard for ownership of these daguerreotypes, these images. So I don't know, that question made me think about how even where there was not consent, your descendants can still come in and again work within this legal framework of copyright and ownership and and defend and perhaps even restore some sort of dignity to a moment. That's a very unprecedented case, because I think it's still ongoing. But it's also really interesting, that case, because I think Ariella Azule writes about how she understands those daguerreotypes also to be to constitute human remains because of the way they were taken. So then it also even adds another layer of like problematics to the whole thing, and consent, and yeah, even just the violence of photography, photographic history, as a medium. But I think, yeah, it's consent forever when it's granted? Probably not. I think no, it's not actually, because if you think about outside of this framework, just in life, consent is not
It's not
forever.
forever.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so I think that applies again to everything. Yeah, and I think I'm gonna think about that more also. So thank you for that question.
Yeah. And thank you so much, everyone. I think this is, yeah, we've come to the end of our time today. Of course, as you can see, Ethel's work is very rich and very deep and very expansive. And so, if you would like to tap into what she's doing, to what she's thinking, feel free to find her on artofetheltower.com, right?
Yes, I believe
Yes.
so.
Yes, yeah.
It is.
artofetheltower.com.
Yes, it
She
is.
has she's made mention of several of her works that can be found on her website. Of course, you can find her on Instagram at Art of Ethel Tawe.
Same thing, yeah.
And yes, yeah. And of course, listening to images. Ethel, thank you so much for sharing time and space with us. Thank you for your words. Thank you for your work. Oh, that does that. Oh my
I
gosh, you're
never
doing it
knew
for
that.
me. Ah,
That's great.
okay. Let me focus back to my thanks. I'm so grateful. And one last question. What are you listening to now? What music, what sounds are you moving towards going?
What am I listening to right now? Um, I think a go-to album that I've just been like putting on is by Mbongwana Star, the Congolese band. I think the album's called From Kinshasa. So that's been getting me, because it's not the brightest of places to be, so I need energy. So I've been listening to that. And enjoying it. But yeah, I think that, yeah, that's what I've been listening. What have you been listening to? Because you always have the sweet songs, the sweet sounds. So I need to know, please.
You know what I've been listening to a lot of? There's this stunning album, a compilation called Amabano, and it's music from Burundi. I think it was recorded in the 70s, 80s. That album, oh my goodness. It gets me
Okay,
going. It gets me going. So it's
please.
called
And
Amabano. Yes.
Amabano.
Amabano. Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. We
Yeah.
got that. Take
Yeah.
notes, everyone, because I know this is gonna be good.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. A recording of this conversation will be made available on our YouTube page, as well as accompanying notes. And once again, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Ethel. I'm so grateful for your presence and for your time. And yeah, I think that is a wrap.
Thank you so much, Marimo. I really appreciate it. Always like the best conversations with you. So yeah, always also very reflective, very a lot to learn always when we exchange. So I appreciate you, and thank you to ADH as well, all of you.
Karibu,
Yeah.
Karibu. Bye,
Bye.
everyone.